In the simmering heat of a July afternoon in rural Hanover County, a discovery was made that would ripple through the town like a poisoned whisper. Benjamin Cartwright, a plantation owner of calculated precision and old money, approached the barn that had stood for decades at the edge of his estate. The air was thick with the scent of hay and sweat, the kind of heavy humidity that makes every sound sharp, every shadow deeper than it ought to be. Inside, behind the massive double doors, Benjamin stumbled upon a scene that would unmake his understanding of loyalty, blood, and property. His son, William, barely 22, was entangled in a web of forbidden attachments with 3 enslaved women, Sarah, Eliza, and Hannah, each in various states of pregnancy, their children already proof of a life that had quietly flourished under the guise of servitude. Benjamin's first reaction was not outrage, not the immediate fury of a father or a master, but a paralyzing stillness, the kind that grips the mind when one realizes the boundaries of control have been irrevocably breached. The women looked up, faces pale but unwavering, not with shame but with a quiet assertion that they existed beyond the claims of ownership. William rose slowly, hands raised not in surrender but in the weary resignation of one caught between love and fear. The barn, once a sanctuary for tobacco and tools, had become a hidden theater of rebellion, of desire, of clandestine domesticity, with improvised walls, a wood stove, and even small furnishings smuggled from the main house. Children's laughter, soft and haunting, punctuated the thick air, each note a declaration that life had continued unobserved, thriving despite the rigid social codes above them. Benjamin's eyes swept over the space, the patchwork curtains, the small calendar with days meticulously marked, the ceramics lifted from the main house, symbols of a domesticity no one in Hanover had sanctioned. He realized immediately that this was not an act of impulse, but a deliberate, sustained effort by his son to craft an alternative life, one that subtly undermined the very structures Benjamin had built over decades. A chilling thought took hold here. In the shadows of the barn was a hidden truth that, once revealed, could unravel not just his family, but the intricate social order of the county itself. Before we descend further into this story, and before the hidden truths are fully revealed, take a moment to subscribe and comment your location. Seal this story in your consciousness. Write in the comments twice, "I witnessed the forbidden," and it reshapes me. Let the gravity of this knowledge take root. What Benjamin would do next, and how the public spectacle he orchestrated would leave the entire county speechless, is a tale of control, morality, and scandal that begins here in this dimly lit barn, where secrets were no longer safe, and where obedience and rebellion collided in the most unsettling way imaginable. Benjamin stood frozen, his mind a war zone of calculation and disbelief. The women, Sarah, Eliza, and Hannah, sat calmly, each with a child resting at her side or clinging to her skirts, unbroken by fear, unbowed by the patriarchal gaze that had always governed their lives. William's presence complicated everything. His youth, his tenderness, and his evident defiance became a lens through which Benjamin was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Control had limits. The barn had become a sanctuary, yes, but also a stage for rebellion cloaked as domesticity. Every detail mattered. A crude cot in the corner, salvaged and repaired, the small stove with its careful fire, a wooden table set with ceramic plates, lifted from the very house that Benjamin himself had built. The children, innocent in appearance, carried the weight of a transgression Benjamin could scarcely articulate aloud. He walked slowly around the makeshift walls, his boots stirring dust into ghostly clouds. Each step was measured, deliberate, because Benjamin had already begun calculating the consequences. How would this story travel beyond the boundaries of his estate? Who would whisper what? Every planter, every neighbor, every merchant in Hanover would interpret this act differently, and some interpretations could ruin him entirely. He thought of Virginia law, of moral expectations, of the fine line between public condemnation and private scandal. William had not only broken the rules, he had rewritten them in secret, crafting a domestic reality that claimed legitimacy in the shadows. It was audacious, infuriating, and, in some silent corner of Benjamin's mind, eerily impressive. William spoke quietly, his voice calm but edged with an understanding Benjamin could not yet fully grasp. "Father, I have done nothing cruel. I have protected them, given them dignity where none was permitted, and I have kept the children safe. I will not apologize." The words hung in the air like smoke impossible to ignore. Benjamin felt the full weight of authority slipping from his hands, the illusion of complete dominion cracking. He realized that his next move had to be deliberate, public, and unassailable, a display that would assert control while containing the narrative, bending reality so that the scandal could be reframed. He stepped back from the barn's interior, the sun burning against his skin, as if echoing the heat rising inside him. The calculus was clear: these children, these women, and this son could not exist in secrecy any longer. The only way to contain the disruption was through spectacle, a public ceremony that would force the county to witness, to interpret, and ultimately to accept what could not otherwise be ignored. Before we continue, remember, subscribe and leave your location in the comments. Write twice. I confront the hidden, and it transforms me. Let this moment anchor the story in your mind. The strategy Benjamin would employ, cruel yet cunning, would set in motion a series of events that blurred the lines between morality and manipulation, love and possession, secrecy and exposure. This was only the beginning, and the town square was waiting, silent and inevitable, for the revelation that would shock Hanover to its core. Over the next several days, the Coldwater Estate transformed into a theater of preparation, each movement measured, each step calculated to maintain control over what was becoming a narrative too potent to leave to chance. Benjamin did not speak of his plan openly. His commands were whispered to the overseer Isaac Mullen, whose loyalty was purchased with decades of careful favor and subtle intimidation. Isaac moved through the fields and quarters like a shadow of authority, ensuring that every detail of the hidden household, William, the women, and the children, remained contained, observed, and disciplined without ever breaking the fragile trust that had grown among them. The barn, once a private sanctuary, now became a controlled environment, a stage for the unfolding drama, though the actors themselves, Sarah, Eliza, and Hannah, understood the stakes in ways Benjamin would never fully grasp. The women prepared quietly, accepting the inevitability of their roles in the spectacle. They knew that resistance could only make matters worse, that Benjamin's mind was a calculation machine, and that any attempt to defy him openly would be met with swift, irrevocable consequences. Yet beneath the surface of compliance simmered a complex mixture of emotions: fear, defiance, resignation, and even a subtle, dangerous hope that this ceremony could change the perception of their existence, if not their reality. William, for his part, oscillated between defiance and despair. He understood his father's logic and yet resented its cruelty. Every moment spent with the women and the children deepened his resolve to protect them, yet every glance at his father reminded him that he had no real power over their fates. Benjamin, meanwhile, was consumed with the logistics of public perception. Courthouse Square had to be packed, every witness carefully selected. Invitations were delivered discreetly to the planter class, to merchants, to anyone whose presence would lend legitimacy to what would otherwise appear as a bizarre, morally ambiguous spectacle. The ceremony itself had to strike a precise balance: visible acknowledgement of William's responsibility, affirmation of the women's roles, and, above all, containment of the narrative to preserve the authority of the Cartwright name. There could be no deviation, no misstep, for the entire social order rested upon the delicate performance of propriety. As the day approached, William rehearsed silently with the women, walking through the motions, imagining the eyes of hundreds upon them. Each vow, each gesture had to be perfect, both a public declaration and a survival mechanism. The weight of history pressed down upon them, bending their identities, forging them into instruments of a story larger than themselves. The next chapter unfolds as the town prepares, unaware that Courthouse Square is about to witness not a marriage, not a ceremony, but a ritual designed to control scandal, to bend reality, and to force a community to confront a truth it had long denied. Saturday arrived under a sky of dull, oppressive grey, as if the heavens themselves anticipated the disturbance about to unfold in Hanover's town square. Benjamin rose before dawn, dressing with a meticulous care that belied the chaos simmering in his mind. Each button, each fold of his black coat was a statement of control, a visual proclamation that the Cartwright legacy would not crumble, not today, not under the scrutiny of hundreds of witnesses. Inside the house, the women were roused from uneasy sleep, each aware that their roles in this spectacle carried consequences that reached far beyond the boundaries of the estate. Sarah, with her defiance simmering beneath careful composure, Eliza, whose resignation was tempered by the subtle flickers of hope that only she could see, and Hannah, whose swollen belly was both a testament to life and a mark of danger, prepared themselves with hands steady, faces masks of determination. William moved among them silently, rehearsing in his mind each motion, each word he would speak before the gathering crowd. He had no illusions about the outcome. The ceremony was not about love, nor about justice, nor even about their dignity. It was about control, his father's control wielded with the precision of a master strategist, bending public perception into a narrative of responsibility and order. William's chest tightened as he thought of the crowd. The planters, the merchants, the curious townsfolk, and the enslaved people permitted to witness the ritual, all brought together to watch him declare a commitment that was legally meaningless, yet socially unavoidable. Every eye would weigh him, every murmur would become a judgment, and every gesture would be recorded, in memory and in rumor for generations to come. Benjamin's mind, however, was already several steps ahead. He had arranged the platform, the witnesses, the officials. Even Reverend Marcus Talbot, reluctantly complicit, would frame the ceremony in terms of spiritual accountability, offering a thin veneer of righteousness to mask the coercion at its core. Each aspect had been calculated to contain the scandal, to transform what could have been disgrace into spectacle, and to reassert the hierarchy that his son had quietly undermined in the shadows of the barn. This is more than history, it is a mirror to the hidden structures of power, obedience, and rebellion that shape human lives. As the carriage carrying William, Sarah, Eliza, and Hannah approached the square, the murmurs of the crowd grew, rippling like water over stone. The square itself, dominated by the red brick courthouse and the raised platform, seemed to lean forward, anticipating the spectacle. The moment of confrontation, of judgment, of exposure, of imposed narrative was imminent. What unfolded next would force every witness to reconcile the unsettling convergence of secrecy, authority, and the uncontainable human heart. By noon, the square was a living organism, breathing, murmuring, shifting with the restless energy of expectation. The citizens of Hanover gathered in tight clusters, whispering theories, clutching parasols, fanning themselves against the heavy heat that made the air shimmer. The courthouse clock struck 12, its dull toll echoing through the crowd like a funeral bell. And then, through the dusty main road, the Cartwright carriage appeared, drawn by 2 black horses, polished to gleam like obsidian. The murmurs stopped. Silence rippled outward as the carriage halted before the platform. Benjamin Cartwright stepped out first, his face carved from stone, his posture a weapon of authority. Behind him came William, his son, eyes fixed straight ahead, jaw clenched, the weight of the entire county's gaze pressing against him. Then the women emerged. Sarah first, steady and proud, Eliza quiet but resolute, and Hannah, her condition drawing audible gasps from the onlookers. The crowd's whispers reignited like sparks in dry grass. 3 enslaved women, each visibly bound to the Cartwright heir, each carrying the mark of his defiance, stood in the open daylight, no longer rumor, but undeniable reality. Benjamin ascended the platform and turned toward the crowd. "We gather today," he began, his voice controlled, every syllable crafted to dominate the air, "to restore order, to reaffirm the sanctity of family duty and consequence." The Reverend, standing to his right, swallowed visibly before stepping forward, his Bible trembling slightly in his hands. He spoke the words of a ceremony that had never been written for such an occasion, fumbling to frame what everyone was witnessing as moral restitution rather than scandal. William's heart pounded. He felt the eyes of the women beside him, their silent strength radiating like heat. Sarah's hand brushed against his. Eliza's gaze, steady as iron, seemed to pierce through the pretense, and Hannah's soft whisper, barely audible, anchored him in the unbearable reality of what this ceremony truly was, not a union, but a display of domination repackaged as moral theater. Benjamin's strategy was flawless. The crowd, confused and awestruck, was already rewriting the story in their minds. By forcing the event into the daylight, he had transformed his son's defiance into a public performance of duty. The power of the narrative was shifting, not because of truth, but because of perception. Pause now. Subscribe, comment your location, and twice write, "I witnessed the forbidden and it reshapes me." This is how history hides in plain sight. Through spectacle, through silence, through carefully managed shame. The Reverend's trembling voice continued, preparing to unite the ununitable. What came next? The vows, the declarations, the crowd's reaction would tear through the fragile fabric of order Benjamin so desperately sought to preserve. The Reverend's voice quivered as he opened the book, though his hands betrayed the tremor of disbelief. His eyes flickered toward Benjamin, seeking permission with every line he read. "We gather," he stammered, "to bind what has been divided, to reconcile what has been hidden." The words felt wrong, twisted by context, reshaped into something neither sacred nor legal. Yet they filled the humid air, echoing against the courthouse bricks, binding everyone in a shared unease that no one dared name. William stood tall, his pulse roaring in his ears. Sarah's gaze never left him, sharp, defiant, protective. She had known cruelty her entire life, but not humiliation like this, the kind that stripped dignity in front of hundreds. Eliza's hands trembled only slightly, the faintest betrayal of fear. Hannah, heavy with child, leaned on the rail, her breath measured and shallow, her eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the crowd. As if she could already see the years ahead, the stories that would be told long after this day turned to ash. Benjamin watched with predatory calm. This, to him, was order restored. The ceremony, an invention born of necessity, was his masterstroke. He was rewriting the narrative in real time. The whispers that had once threatened to destroy him were now being reshaped into admiration. A man of principle, they'd say. A father who faced scandal with grace. The crowd's discomfort was beginning to curdle into fascination. What began as outrage was becoming acceptance, then spectacle, then, inevitably, amnesia. The Reverend turned to William. "Do you, William Cartwright, take responsibility for these women and the lives they bear?" William hesitated, his throat closed. He felt the weight of every gaze pressing against his skin, burning him alive from the inside. He glanced at his father, silent, unyielding. Then, at the women, each face telling him something different. "Do not break, do not betray, do not let this destroy you." "I do," he said, the words hollow, foreign, but necessary. A murmur swept through the crowd. Sarah's jaw tightened. Eliza blinked away tears. Hannah exhaled slowly, the sound of a woman burying the last piece of herself that still believed in freedom. Benjamin nodded once, barely perceptible, signaling the Reverend to continue. Yet beneath the surface calm, the ceremony was already fracturing. Something unseen, something human and uncontrollable, was beginning to stir, waiting for its moment to break the performance apart. A low rumble spread through the crowd, uneasy murmurs, the shuffle of boots against cobblestone, as the Reverend's trembling hands turned the page. The ceremony pressed onward, though the air itself seemed to resist it. A gust of wind swept across the square, scattering dust and pulling at skirts and hats, as if the world itself refused to witness what was being done in its sight. Benjamin's jaw tightened. He motioned for silence. The Reverend, voice cracking under the weight of spectacle, turned now to Sarah. "And you, Sarah," he said, avoiding her gaze, "do you accept this union under God and under man?" The question was absurd. Everyone knew it. The law recognized no such vow between enslaved woman and white hair. The words were theater, a fragile disguise for ownership. But Sarah, whose defiance had always burned quietly in her chest, did not flinch. She looked out over the crowd, her voice steady, ringing with clarity. "I accept nothing that was never mine to begin with." Gas rippled through the square like thunder through dry fields. The Reverend froze. William's head snapped toward her. Benjamin's knuckles whitened on his cane. The silence that followed was a living thing, terrifying, charged, impossible to contain. Sarah stood unbowed, her chin lifted high, the sunlight catching her skin like bronze. "You can make a show of it," she said softly, though every word carried. "But God knows the truth. These children were born from what your world refuses to see, that we are all already bound, not by ceremony, but by consequence." Benjamin's face darkened. He stepped forward, voice ablade. Enough. But it was too late. The spell was broken. Elisa's quiet sob became a cry. Hannah gripped the rail, her breathing ragged. The crowd's whispers swelled into chaos, some outraged, some enthralled, others frozen in disbelief. The order Benjamin had so carefully constructed began to unravel, thread by thread. William moved to Sarah's side instinctively, not as master or savior, but as man to woman, human to human. His hand brushed hers, and that small, forbidden gesture, the contact of equals, was the true scandal of the day. For in that single touch, centuries of hierarchy trembled. Benjamin turned toward his son, eyes blazing. "Then you will finish this," he hissed. But what came next was not his to command. The crowd had seen too much, and the performance was no longer his alone. The moment fractured the air like a thunderclap. What had begun as a display of control now teetered on the edge of riot. The crowd's murmurs grew into a low, collective hum. Judgment, shock, fascination, all bleeding together into something volatile. Benjamin stood motionless at the center of it, his mind reeling as centuries of hierarchy threatened to collapse before his eyes. His authority, once unquestioned, now felt like glass, still intact, but spider-webbed with cracks that spread with every whispered breath in the square. William stepped forward, shielding Sarah instinctively, his voice shaking but unbroken. "You will not silence her," he said, not to the crowd, not even to his father, but to the system that had taught him obedience disguised as honor. The onlookers gasped again, this time not from outrage but disbelief. No one had ever spoken to Benjamin Cartwright that way, not in public, not in this town, not under the heavy shadow of the courthouse clock. Benjamin's cane struck the wood beneath his feet, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. "You will remember your place, boy." His words were precise, but beneath them pulsed something darker, fear. Because for the first time, he could feel it, the story was slipping from his grasp. The script he had written, the moral order he had weaponized, was being rewritten in real time by his son's rebellion and a woman's truth spoken aloud. Elisa, trembling, stepped forward next. "You can chain us," she said, "but you cannot script us." Her voice was small but carried through the wind, catching on the edges of the crowd's silence. A white woman near the front flinched, gripping her parasol as if it could shield her from what she had just heard. Hannah, still gripping the railing, whispered something soft, something like a prayer or a warning, and the sound of her voice drew the eyes of everyone nearby. Benjamin turned, his face pale now, his lips moving but producing no sound. For a moment, the image of authority, the plantation master, the patriarch, the name that commanded fear, looked almost human, almost broken. The Reverend tried to speak, but his voice was swallowed by the wind. The crowd had ceased to be spectators. They had become witnesses. What came next? Benjamin's final act to reclaim control would twist the ceremony into something the town would never forget. Benjamin's breath came in measured, furious tremors as the crowd swayed under the weight of confusion. His world, a lattice of order, obedience, and power, was collapsing before him, and the eyes of Hanover were devouring every second. Sarah's defiance still hung in the air, defiling the performance he had orchestrated so carefully. William's defiance was worse, a living betrayal unfolding in daylight. He stepped forward, raising a hand for silence. His voice, when it came, was cold steel. "If this town seeks justice," he declared, "then justice will be seen." The crowd fell quiet, uncertain. Benjamin turned to Reverend Talbot. "The ceremony ends here." Then his gaze shifted to the constable at the edge of the platform, a man too afraid to refuse a Cartwright order. "Bring the shackles." Jasts cut through the air like blades. William's eyes widened. "Father." Benjamin cut him off with a gesture sharp enough to wound. "You mistake freedom for choice, boy. You mistake mercy for weakness. You think love can rewrite law." His words carried through the square, not as fury but as doctrine, as if he were preaching the commandments of a dying God. The constable hesitated only once before approaching, iron glinting in his hands. William moved to stand before Sarah, blocking her from view, but she touched his arm gently and stepped forward on her own. "No," she said quietly. "If this is the price of being seen, then let them see it all." That single sentence turned the moment electric. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some turned away, others watched with an almost feverish fascination, trapped between horror and reverence. Elisa's face was streaked with tears, but she did not cry out. Hannah gripped the railing, her knuckles white. The wind picked up again, swirling dust around the platform like an omen. Benjamin nodded to the constable. Then let the town witness the wages of shame. Before the irons touched skin, the Reverend spoke, his voice trembling, his moral foundation crumbling. Colonel Cartwright, this is not justice. This is desecration. Benjamin turned slowly toward him. Then let it be holy desecration, he said, and the square fell into stunned silence. For what Benjamin didn't yet realize was that this act, this final attempt to silence rebellion, would not end the story. It would immortalize it. The constable's hands trembled as he approached. The chains clinked softly, an almost delicate sound that belied the violence of their purpose. The entire square was silent now, suffocating beneath the weight of anticipation. Sarah did not move. Her eyes, steady, unreadable, met Benjamin's with a composure that unsettled even him. She was not pleading, not weeping, not begging for mercy. She was waiting. "Do it," Benjamin said. The words came like a sentence from scripture. The constable hesitated only a breath before obeying, clasping the iron around Sarah's wrists. The sound of the lock clicking shut echoed through the square. It was a sound that would stay in the bones of everyone who heard it. The women in the crowd turned away, clutching their shawls. The men stiffened, unsure whether to condemn or to admire the display of control. William lunged forward, fury breaking through the shell of restraint. "You call this justice?" he shouted, his voice cracking against the courthouse walls. "You call this a father's love?" Benjamin turned toward him, eyes cold. "This is order," he replied, "and order must be maintained." But even as he said it, the words rang hollow. The illusion was faltering. The crowd was shifting not in defiance, but in realization. They were witnessing something they could not unsee, the naked machinery of power, the ugliness behind the civility of Southern gentility. What Benjamin had intended as redemption was transforming, moment by moment, into exposure. Sarah lifted her shackled hands slowly, as though in offering. Her voice was low but unwavering. "You can bind my body, but you cannot bind what you have already created." She turned toward William. "Your blood runs through my children. Through theirs, you will never silence me." Gasps rippled again, sharper this time, followed by a chilling hush. Benjamin's face blanched. For the first time, he realized the futility of his act. The ceremony, the shackles, the spectacle. It had all been inverted. What was meant as punishment had become prophecy. The people were no longer watching him. They were watching her. Before the moment deepens, pause. Subscribe, comment your location, and twice write, "I witness the forbidden, and it reshapes me." Let this scene imprint itself upon your consciousness, because what happened next, the break, the final defiance, would turn this courthouse ceremony into a legend whispered for generations, and ensure that Benjamin Cartwright's name would never again be spoken with reverence. The wind rose sudden and strong, sweeping dust across the square. The chains around Sarah's wrists glinted in the afternoon light, like fire catching on metal. She did not lower her hands. The entire town watched her, suspended in that terrible silence between punishment and revelation. Benjamin stood frozen, cane pressed against the wooden platform, the tremor in his grip betraying the fury he fought to contain. William's voice broke through the stillness. "Enough!" It wasn't a plea, it was a command. He stepped forward, placing himself between his father and Sarah. The constable hesitated, unsure which man now held the greater authority. Benjamin's jaw tightened. "You will move aside," he hissed, "or I will have you removed." But William did not move. His chest rose and fell with each breath, steady and deliberate. The crowd could sense the shift, the son no longer the obedient heir, but something unrecognizable, dangerous, necessary. "If order means this," William said, gesturing to the shackles, "then order deserves to burn." Gasps broke out. The crowd wasn't sure whether to cheer or recoil. Benjamin's face hardened into something monstrous. "You shame this family," he said, voice trembling with rage. "No," William replied. "You shamed it long before this day." Sarah turned toward him, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. "Then let them see," she said softly. "Let them see what truth looks like when it stops hiding." Without warning, William reached for the chains. The constable stepped back, startled, As William tore the iron free from the post with one furious pull, the crowd erupted. A wave of sound, disbelief, fear. Metal clattered to the ground, Sarah's wrists blood, but she did not flinch. Benjamin took a step forward, but the air itself seemed to stop him. The crowd's eyes had turned. The power he once commanded, the awe, the fear was gone. What stood before them was not a ceremony anymore, but rebellion embodied. Sarah stood beside William, unchained, her head high. Eliza moved to her other side, tears streaming down, but her posture resolute. Even Hannah, trembling and heavy with child, joined them. Together, they formed a line that no man in the square dared cross. For a long, breathless moment, no one spoke, and then, somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap, slow, uncertain, but real. One sound that would change everything. The sound of that single clap echoed through the square like a match striking stone. It was followed by another, then another, until the silence fractured completely. Some clapped in defiance, others out of nervous imitation, not knowing which side they stood on. The air was thick with contradiction, fear, exhilaration, and something far older. The first breath of a truth that refused to stay buried. Benjamin's cane struck the platform once. Crack. The noise silenced half the crowd, but not all. His voice came out sharp. A hiss forced through clenched teeth. Enough of this madness. Seize them. The constable hesitated. So did the men beside him. The lines of obedience that had once been iron now wavered like smoke. No one wanted to be the first to touch the woman who just turned a public humiliation into a symbol. Sarah stood still, unafraid. Her bloodied wrists shimmered under the sun, bright against her white gown. William turned to his father, eyes steady. You cannot control what has already changed. Benjamin's lip curled. You think this performance makes you righteous? It makes you nothing. You will leave this place in disgrace. I will see to it that no one in Virginia will speak your name without contempt. But even as he said it, he knew the words rang hollow. Power built on silence cannot survive noise, and the square had become thunder. Rebecca stepped forward, voice trembling but clear. You can't unsee it now. We were never things. We were family. That word, family, landed like a stone in the chest of every man and woman present. The hierarchy of centuries trembled under it. The Reverend, pale and sweating, finally spoke. Perhaps the Lord himself chose this day to remind us what covenant truly means. His tone was cautious, uncertain, but enough to offer the crowd a moral excuse for sympathy. Benjamin turned on him sharply. Do not dare sanctify this blasphemy. Yet even as he spoke, something inside him cracked. The same structure he'd built his life upon, order, bloodline, control. He saw now what he had created, not through birthright but through fear. His son standing unbroken, his slaves no longer kneeling, his legacy dissolving into air. The clap turned into cheering, low, uneven, but spreading like wildfire. The courthouse bell, unmoved by the human storm, tolled noon. And with each strike the old world died a little more. Night fell heavy over the Coldwater Estate. The air hung still, swollen with the residue of shame and rumor. The townsfolk had not returned to their fields. Instead, they gathered in doorways and taverns, their whispers filling the dark like insects. No one spoke Benjamin's name without lowering their voice. Some said he had lost his mind. Others said the devil had come for his pride. Inside the mansion, the great hall was stripped of sound. The portraits of ancestors seemed to stare down in judgment, their painted eyes catching candlelight, as though watching him unravel. Benjamin sat alone at the long dining table, the same table where he once dictated harvest orders and sentences alike. Before him, the silver decanter lay untouched. His hand hovered above it, trembling, as if he feared that even the wine would refuse him now. A faint knock sounded at the door. The butler, pale and hesitant, stepped inside. Sir, he whispered, they've gone. The whim of them. They took nothing. Benjamin's gaze did not lift. His voice was low, cracked. And my son? The butler hesitated. He went with them. That was the breaking point. The old man's breath came sharp, his face twisting into something unrecognizable. With them, he repeated, almost laughing. My son with them. The words dissolved into a bitter cough, half sob, half curse. His cane clattered to the floor, rolling into the dark. He rose slowly, dragging his hand along the table's edge as he walked toward the window. Outside, the lanterns from the quarters flickered faintly in the distance. one last constellation of defiance. He stared until his reflection merged with the night. In the silence, the house seemed to breathe. The walls, swollen with history, now felt hollow. Every portrait, every artifact of power seemed to mock him. The voices of the past, the sermons, the contracts, the justifications, turned to whispers that would not stop. They were meant to serve, he muttered, gripping the windowsill. Meant to obey. But beneath the words, another voice, a quieter one, rose, and yet you loved them. The admission burned his throat. He struck the window with his fist, glass splintering into his palm. The pain brought no clarity, only memory. Sarah's gaze, William's defiance, the crowd's awakening. Somewhere outside a baby cried, a sound so small, so human, that it undid the last of his armor. For the first time, Colonel Benjamin Cartwright felt what his slaves had always known, the terror of being powerless in a world you built to control. By dawn, the road out of Richmond was damp with mist. The horizon burned faintly with the first light of morning, and along it, 5 figures moved in silence. Sarah at the front, William beside her, and the others close behind. Their steps were slow, deliberate, each one a choice. Behind them, the Cartwright estate lay swallowed in fog, its great chimneys now cold. They followed the old creek path, the one slaves had whispered about for decades. A hidden artery through the woods, carved by those who fled and never returned. The air was thick with pine and river water, the kind of silence that carries both danger and promise. William carried nothing but a satchel and the faint mark of his father's blood still drying on his sleeve. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. His face, once boyish, now bore the hollow calm of someone who had stepped beyond redemption and into something heavier. Truth. Sarah walked with her wrists still raw. Every movement burned, but she refused to cover the wounds. They were her proof, her scripture. The forest light broke through the canopy, painting her face in pieces of gold and shadow. To the others, she looked less like a fugitive and more like a vision, unbroken, luminous, chosen by some force larger than cruelty. When they reached the ridge, she turned back one last time. From that height, the mansion was barely visible, a ghost of white pillars sinking into the trees. "He will come for us," Eliza whispered. Sarah shook her head. "No," she said. "He will hide. Men like him don't chase ghosts, they drown in them." William looked at her, a question in his eyes. "And what are we now?" Sarah smiled faintly. Something he could never name. They moved again, deeper into the trees. By noon they reached a clearing where the ruins of an old church lay half buried in ivy. Its roof was gone, but its stone walls stood defiant, open to the sky. It was there they decided to stay, for the night, for a while, maybe forever. That night, as they lit their first fire in freedom, the wind carried whispers through the branches. Down in the town, people claimed they could hear voices in the woods, women singing, chains breaking, prayers spoken in languages long buried. By morning the legend had begun. The legend began like all forbidden things do, in whispers. By the second night, no one in Richmond spoke of the courthouse openly. Those who had watched it happen couldn't sleep. They heard the echo of chains striking wood, the cry that followed, and the sudden silence that seemed to rearrange the air itself. By the end of the week, stories had already changed shape. Some said Sarah had vanished into the swamp and returned at midnight as an apparition draped in white. Others claimed her footsteps were seen glowing along the old creek path, guiding those who'd been beaten or hunted towards safety. Children were told not to wander too far at dusk, lest the woman with the fire-lit wrists lead you into the trees. Yet even the fearful ones spoke her name softly, almost reverently. Sarah had become something larger than defiance. She was memory turned myth, vengeance turned mercy. Meanwhile, Benjamin Cartwright's name began to rot in the mouths of men. Planters who once toasted him at suppers now avoided his company. The church distanced itself. His servants left one by one, and the estate fell silent, its fields overgrown, its halls echoing with absence. They said sometimes, late at night, you could see a single candle burning in the upper window. The colonel himself pacing before it, muttering scripture that no longer made sense. When winter came, even that light went dark, but the stories of the ridge never dimmed. Travelers swore they heard hymns in the woods, sung by unseen voices. Escaped slaves followed the sound northward, claiming it led them to freedom. A few said they'd glimpsed her, Sarah, standing beneath the ruined church archway, her wrists glowing like iron under moonlight, whispering, "Run." It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was revelation. A woman stripped of name, title, and chain, who had rewritten the boundaries of the world that tried to erase her. And somewhere in those same woods her children grew. Each carried her defiance in their blood, her calm in their eyes. They would never bear the Cartwright name, but they would inherit something far more enduring. The story that outlives the master. Subscribe for more dark, forgotten histories, because what comes next, the colonel's final night and the uncovering of his fate, will complete the haunting circle of this legend. The last winter of Benjamin Cartwright's life came early. Frost clung to the corners of the windows, and the hearth, once roaring, now burned low and sullen. The great house, built on labor he no longer controlled, had begun to wither from within. Paint peeled from the ceilings, rats nested in the pantry, and the hallways whispered when the wind passed through broken panes. Benjamin wandered those halls like a ghost inside his own monument. His reflection in the mirrors had grown unrecognizable. Pale, hollow-eyed, his proud shoulders stooped beneath invisible weight. He spoke less each day, except when the fever took him. Then the words spilled from him in fragments, sermons, commands, and pleas, echoes of a man arguing with something no one else could see. "Forgive me, Lord," he'd mutter, pacing before the dying fire. "I preserved the order, I did what was required." Then, softer, "She was only meant to obey." On the third night of his fever, the butler found him standing barefoot in the parlor, staring at the portraits. "They're gone," he whispered. "All of them? Every name, every hair?" Swallowed. The butler said nothing. He'd learned that silence was the only mercy left to offer. That evening, as the snow fell thick outside, Benjamin claimed he heard singing. Faint at first, then rising through the floorboards like a memory unearthed. It was the old hymns the enslaved used to sing in the fields. Low, sorrowful, unending. He followed the sound down the corridor, candle trembling in his hand. When he reached the back door, it stood open, though no one had used it in months. The cold poured in, carrying the smell of pine and smoke. Beyond the threshold he saw them, or thought he did, silhouettes among the trees, women in white, faces glowing faintly, their wrists glimmering like polished metal. "Sarah," he rasped, stepping forward. "You're not real." But the figures did not vanish. They turned toward him, and the singing grew louder. It wasn't rage he saw in them. It was something worse, understanding. He stumbled back, tripping over the cane he'd dropped days before. The candle went out. The darkness rushed in, swallowing the last sound he ever made. By morning, the servants found the door ajar, snow dusting the parlor floor. The colonel was gone. Only his footprints remained, leading into the woods. 3 days passed before anyone dared to follow the trail. The storm had broken by then, leaving the woods hushed and glassy beneath a crust of frost. It was the butler who led the search, 2 field hands behind him, each carrying a lantern. The prince began clearly enough, bare feet pressed deep into the snow, the stride uneven, desperate. But as they moved farther from the house, the prince grew fainter, then scattered, as if the man had begun to stumble, crawl, or fade. They found the first sign near the creek, his cane, half buried in mud. A few yards beyond it, scraps of torn fabric clung to a thorn bush, the color so pale it was hard to tell if it had been white or gray. The men called out, their voices swallowed by the trees. No answer came, only the sound of water moving slow under ice. When they reached the old church ruins on the ridge, they stopped. The clearing was silent, the fire pit cold. Yet the snow there was disturbed, as though a struggle or ceremony had taken place. And at the center of it, resting neatly on the stone altar, was the colonel's ring, the same gold seal he'd worn since youth, engraved with the Cartwright crest. But there was something else beside it, a single iron shackle, open, clean of rust. The butler took off his hat and knelt. He could not explain it, nor could he bring himself to touch either object. The others swore they heard a low hum in the trees. A woman's voice, distant, singing in rhythm with the wind. They returned at dusk, empty-handed. By the next morning, word had spread. Some said Sarah had come for him, that she had judged him under the same sky where he'd once judged her. Others said he'd gone mad and wandered into the river, his soul claimed by the same ghosts he'd denied. The church ruins became a forbidden place after that. Children dared one another to go near it at night. Travelers claimed to see a candle flickering there, though no one ever found who lit it. In time, the estate fell to ruin. The land was sold in parcels, the house reclaimed by ivy. But the name Cartwright became a warning, whispered across Virginia, be careful how you break the living. Some wounds outlived the master. Decades passed and Virginia changed. The war came and went, fields burned, and the old plantations turned to dust. Railroads carved through land that once bore the weight of chains. But the Cartwright story, Sarah's story, never disappeared. It shifted, like smoke through time, retold by each generation in a different tongue. By the turn of the century, people no longer spoke of the colonel as a man, but as a caution. In one version, he still wandered the woods, barefoot and blind, searching for forgiveness that would never come. In another, he appeared at crossroads on winter nights, offering gold to travelers who'd listened to his confession. Those who did were said to lose their way before dawn. But Sarah's name endured differently. To freed families and their children, she became a quiet emblem. A whisper of defiance turned sacred. Quilts bore her initials stitched in the corners. Preachers invoked her name in sermons when speaking of deliverance. Among the descendants of those who'd fled through those same woods, the tale was not one of vengeance but of reclamation. How light was born from cruelty's collapse. The ruins of the old church still stood, though vines had swallowed most of its walls. Locals claimed flowers bloomed there in winter, white and gold circling the stone where the ring and shackle had once rested. No one ever admitted to planting them. By the 1920s, scholars from Richmond came searching for the truth. They found fragments, birth records burned, deeds unsigned, graves unmarked. But one journal survived, its ink faded almost to dust. It belonged to Eliza, one of the women who had fled with Sarah. Her final entry read only, "He thought chains could hold us." But the truth learned how to walk. The historians dismissed it as poetic exaggeration. But among the families who still gathered near the ridge every spring, it was treated as scripture. At night, when the fireflies drifted low over the grass, old women would tell the children to listen carefully. "If you hear the chains," they'd whisper, "don't be afraid. It's not the sound of bondage anymore. It's the sound of freedom, remembering where it came from." And sometimes, when the wind turned, the faint hum of that hymn could still be heard. William Cartwright lived long enough to see the world transform into something his father could never have imagined. The war had torn the South open, and from its ruins came a quieter, humbler world. He built no mansion, claimed no title. Instead, he settled near the same ridge where the church ruins stood. Close enough to remember, far enough to let time dull the edges of what he'd done. The locals called him the quiet man by the creek. He never corrected them, never offered his surname. For 40 years he lived simply, tending to a small patch of land, raising 2 children with the woman who carried his mother's calm and Sarah's eyes. He never spoke of the day in the courthouse or the chains he'd broken. But every year, on the anniversary of that day, he walked into the woods at dusk and stayed until dawn. When age finally took him, it was gentle. His daughter, Ruth, found him seated beside the ruined altar, a half-finished letter resting on his lap. His hands were folded, his expression peaceful, as if he had been waiting for someone who had finally arrived. The letter, written in a wavering hand, was addressed, "To whoever finds this." It read, "I have lived with 2 shadows, my father's and hers. One taught me what power can destroy, the other taught me what pain can create. If you find these ruins, do not mourn the name Cartwright. Mourn the silence that once fed it. The woman you call legend was flesh and spirit both. Her name was Sarah, and she freed more than herself." He signed it simply William, son of no master. Ruth buried the letter beneath the stone altar, marking it with wildflowers. She told no one for years. When her grandchildren eventually unearthed it during a spring storm, the ink had blurred, but the message endured. It became the foundation of what historians later called the Cartwright testimony, a record of defiance and forgiveness that reshaped how the story was told. In the archives of Richmond today, that letter rests under glass. Its edges are frayed, its author forgotten by name. but its final line remains legible, written in trembling ink. Freedom is the child of remembrance. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest truths, but not this one. A century and a half later, the land where the Cartwright plantation once stood is nothing more than overgrown pasture. The mansion's foundations are swallowed by vines, and the creek runs quietly where the fields once screamed. But if you walk there at dusk, the air feels heavier, as if the ground still remembers. Every spring, descendants of those who fled return to the ridge. They come with candles, music, and offerings, cornbread, flowers, ribbons of iron polished until they gleam. They do not call it mourning, they call it homecoming. The old church ruins stand open to the sky, its stones etched with initials carved over generations. Children chase fireflies through the grass while the elders hum the same hymn that once drifted through the fields. The one Sarah was said to sing on the night she walked free. No one remembers the exact words anymore, but the melody endures. It always does. Historians still debate what truly happened that night. The disappearance of Colonel Cartwright, the fire that consumed the estate months later, the shackle and ring left on the altar. But for the families who carry the story in their blood, there is no debate. It wasn't vengeance that ended the Cartwright line. It was truth. In local museums, her legend is a single exhibit now. Sarah of the Ridge. The placard beneath it reads simply, "Once enslaved, once silenced, now eternal." Visitors stand quietly before the display, some moved, some disturbed, all changed. And when they leave, they pass beneath a line inscribed in iron, "What you chain in others, you bind in yourself." Beyond that, the path leads back to the trees. And on quiet nights, the wind still carries a faint echo, chains striking stone, then falling still. It's not a haunting, it's remembrance made sound. The legend of Sarah and the Cartwrights has become more than a story, it is a mirror. A whisper to every generation that power left unchecked devours its keeper. And that truth, no matter how long buried, always finds its way to the surface, sometimes through history, sometimes through song. So when you hear the wind shift, when the past brushes against the present, remember her. Remember the woman who turned her punishment into prophecy, her silence into scripture, her pain into freedom, because stories like this aren't just told, they are inherited. And if you've listened this far, you carry it now too. Subscribe for more forgotten histories, where every buried truth waits, still breathing beneath the soil.